Coming up on Paris on Politics.
Iran retaliates for Saturday's bombing by targeting a U.S. base in Qatar. We have reaction from local members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. Plus, a Chicago activist says Trump's decision to target Iran nuclear sites will only cause more instability. And a new analysis shows a staggering amount of CPS schools are more than half empty and costing taxpayers big.
This is Paris on Politics from Fox 32 Chicago.
Welcome to Paris on Politics. Boy, the news is shifting by the hour. President Trump today announces that Israel and Iran have agreed to a ceasefire. This after signaling he will not retaliate for Iran strikes on a U.S. military base in Qatar. In fact, he says the missiles didn't even hit the base or cause damage. And all of that is after Saturday's decision to bomb supposed nuclear sites in Iran. We have full coverage tonight, starting with Illinois Congressman Mike Quigley, a member of the House Select Committee on Intelligence. Congressman Quigley, thanks for speaking with us. And I know you were just briefed in committee this evening. Is there anything you can tell us that you've learned about, first of all, the attack in Qatar?
Look, I think that was anticipated. Iran was going to make some sort of response, if only to save face. But I think because of the manner in which they did, Iran was actually trying not to be escalatory, and that's at least some hope. And the fact that we're starting to, we're going to hear about a ceasefire that'll take place in the next 24 hours is also good news. My concern when all this happened was the president's move was dramatically escalatory with a state known for terrorist attacks elsewhere with proxies. I was concerned immediately for the 40,000 U.S. service members and civilians in the Middle East, and also concerned for attacks on the homeland here in the United States. I think those threats are still real, despite the fact that the president, as he typically does, speaks hyperbolically that everything was obliterated. Iran has survived numerous attacks on its nuclear infrastructure in the past. It's hard to imagine with materials that are so mobile that they were completely successful. These are difficult, hard targets, and the threat remains. So, as always, diplomacy is going to be the key.
And speaking of that threat, the Saturday bombings, there are some reports that Iran still has enriched uranium, that somehow they might have been able to move it from storage, especially that Fordow facility. Is there any intelligence that tells you what the ultimate impact was?
Yeah, look, I can't speak to classified. I would just stress the obvious that they've survived this before. It's mobile. These are difficult targets. And as a result, I think the only way you're ever going to end the threat besides diplomatically is troops on the ground. So what concerned me initially was when the president talked about regime change. Well, regime change doesn't come from simply firing missiles from afar or bombings. It comes from troops on the ground. So then you're talking about, another war in the Middle East. And no one I know of in the United States favors such actions. So the fact that we seem to step back from that to a degree is hopeful. But again, remembering how we got here, we did have the JCPOA. We had the Iran nuclear deal, and Iran was in compliance. They weren't building they weren't moving forward with materials for a nuclear weapon. And President Trump in his first term removed us from that. So after all this, maybe they go back to negotiations, and maybe we get back to the original deal that was negotiated under President Obama. The ironies abound.
Well, and there are some reports tonight that they won't comply with UN weapons inspectors like they did during that GCPO agreement. So there's still a lot to sort out, including the intelligence here, because you have the president basically saying that his own intelligence director was wrong when she said they weren't building a nuclear weapon. So was this really an imminent threat?
The president has appointed sycophant inexperienced people at key spots in the intelligence community. So, if he wants to complain about him now, it's his own fault. He didn't bring in people with expertise and understanding of this. He didn't want people who would disagree with him. I won't comment as to what's classified, but, he has never trusted the intelligence community. In fact, there were times when he trusted Putin and Putin's talking points over all 17 entities in the community. So the president gets what he created, an intelligence hierarchy that is unqualified for the job.
All right, Congressman Mike Quigley will continue to follow these developments, and thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Anytime.
For the latest on the attacks on American air bases and the escalating situation in the Middle East, we're joined by Illinois Republican Congressman Darren LaHood from Washington, D.C. Congressman, I know that you're about to be briefed on this as a member of the Intelligence Committee, but what do we know right now about this hit on the air base in Qatar? Any casualties, the extent of the damage? What do you know?
Well, Paris, thanks for having me on. At this point, we're not aware of any damage to U.S. facilities or to any troops in Qatar or other regions in the Middle East. Obviously, President Trump's #1 priority is protection of our 40,000 U.S. troops that are positioned throughout the Middle East. And so at this point, there's no word or no reports of casualties.
Do you expect the Trump administration to counter this hit, or is this, in essence, an exit ramp here offered by the Iranians?
Well, we'll see what happens. We'll see how extensive these attacks by the Iranians are, and whether it causes any damage. But make no mistake about it, Paris, what President Trump and his national security team did on Saturday night was they rid the world of grave nuclear threat and taking out the nuclear facilities in Iran. This was after a lot of due diligence and a thoughtful process through the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the Secretary of State. And remember, we also, for 60 days, met with the Iranians in Oman. President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, asked for peace, wanted to have a peaceful resolution, gave them 60 days. Of course, that didn't result in peace, and Iranians doubled down on wanting to have a bomb more than they wanted peace.
Although there's varying assessments of that, because the U.S. ODNI Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard testified that they were not currently building a nuclear bomb. They might have been enriching uranium, but not building a nuclear bomb. So does that cast any doubt in your mind as to the pretext for their justification for the action?
Well, I think what you saw, President Trump responded that DNI Gabbard was wrong on that assessment. There was clearly a threat posed by the enrichment process that was being done at these three facilities by the Iranian regime, and they continue to engage in this process. And the envoy, Steve Witkoff, who met with the Iranians, specifically told them what they needed to do over the 60-day period to have a peaceful resolution here. They refused to do that, and this was the result.
There are varying reports as well as to the success of that mission on Saturday, that Iran might have been able to relocate some of its nuclear material, especially from that Fordow facility. What do we know about that? President Trump has declared, total victory, but we don't know that for sure, do we?
Well, as he said at his press conference, this was total obliteration of those facilities. So I take him at his word on that. We'll learn new information as we find out more about those strikes and what happened. But I feel very confident, and I know the Department of Defense does, on the goal of significantly destabilizing and eliminating the nuclear capability of Iran, and that was the goal all along.
There are many of your colleagues, especially most on the Democratic side, that are concerned about what the U.S. has done and the counteraction. But then also some Republican colleagues of yours, like Thomas Massie in Kentucky and Marjorie Taylor Greene, that said, MAGA was all about no more entanglements in endless foreign wars. Is Trump violating that campaign promise with this action?
Well, I don't think so. And I think that we do have isolationists in our party, but I wouldn't call President Trump an isolationist. This was something that was in the best interest of the United States. He has a obligation and responsibility to look out for the best interest and the safety and security of U.S. citizens. Taking out this nuclear ability of Iran to have nuclear warheads was the right thing to do, in my view. And I think the vast majority of Republicans believe that. I would also say, Paris, this is not Iraq. We are not sending troops in. We're not, having a ground offensive. This was 3 targeted and strategic strikes by our bombers that took out their nuclear facility, period.
All right, Congressman Darren LaHood from Peoria and parts of the Chicagoland region. We know you're going to be briefed on this, so we hope to talk to you throughout the coming weeks on this. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paris.
And for another view, we are joined by Sarah Hagdousti, Chicago-based executive director of the group Win Without War. Sarah, thanks for speaking with us. So you heard some of that. Just want to get your reaction to all this developing news, the ceasefire announcement, the bombing today, the bombing on Saturday.
Very cautiously optimistic about the ceasefire announcement. Any de-escalations and off-ramps are things that we should be very, very supportive of. I would very much disagree with your previous speaker. I do not believe that we should be taking Donald Trump at his word when he says that these sites have been obliterated. The U.S. military officials have told us that they have not been able to confirm that. We are hearing increasingly reports that people are not able to locate uranium stockpiles that the Iranian government had. And frankly, what this reckless decision has done has meant that people in Iran are in more danger, people in Israel are in more danger, and has put our troops in very real risk, all with the outcome of further driving Iran's nuclear program underground, making it more covert, making it more likely that they do make a decision to develop a weapon when, as you pointed out only minutes ago, U.S. intelligence officials and European intelligence had shown again and again that they had not yet made that decision.
And what Republicans have said is that the U.S. tried diplomacy, that the envoy to the Middle East gave 60 days for Iran to come to a deal, and he says they didn't engage in good faith. Do you agree that if diplomacy didn't work, that this was a necessary option? Well, clearly you don't, but what about their justification?
We had a nuclear deal with Iran. We had diplomacy did work. Donald Trump walked away from it unilaterally in his first term. And now, as the Iranian government was at the negotiating table, we saw them essentially greenlight the Israeli government doing strikes on its nuclear program. Now, I just want to make it clear, not only is that incredibly dangerous for us being no longer to have access to monitoring and inspections of Iran's nuclear program, it is dangerous for nuclear nonproliferation throughout the region. But even more concerningly, let's think for a minute what this is doing to the United States' reputation. It is key to our national security that we be able to engage diplomatically with other countries and for them to be able to take them at our word. What Donald Trump has done is shown that if the U.S. enters an agreement with another country, they can unilaterally walk away. If other countries come to a table, that will not stop them from being bombed by the United States. And that is not where we want to be as a country, where there are so many national security risks that we can only resolve through diplomatic means.
You said you were hopeful about this ceasefire. Would a ceasefire, if it indeed comes to pass, help stabilize the region and all the countries there, whether it be Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Jordan, you name it?
Absolutely. A ceasefire is crucial. The thing that we know is going to drive more instability and more chaos in the region is having more war, more bombs, and more of these kinds of reckless decision-making. We need to, and in terms of when we talk about Israel, I just want to remind folks that we still have hostages being held in Gaza, and it is surprising to me that the Israeli government is prioritizing attacks on another country as opposed to figuring out a way to get those hostages home safely after they've been in captivity for nearly 2 years.
All right, Sarah Hagdusti, and as I understand, you're in Washington to meet with some members of Congress. So what is your message to them?
My message is that Congress needs to be doing their fundamental role right now. They are a key check and balance. Congress is the one that makes decisions about when we go to war, and it is crucial that they act right now to ensure that the Trump administration cannot take further reckless actions that put so many lives at risk unnecessarily.
All right, Sarah Hagdusti of the Chicago-based group Win Without War, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much.
Well, you've heard about political third rails, and here in Chicago, the discussion around CPS school closures is the big third rail. But a new report from the education magazine Chalkbeat Chicago finds that nearly 1/3 of CPS schools is half enrolled, and 47 schools are 2/3 empty. The report finds it's leading to limited educational opportunities for students at those schools. And joining us now is Chalkbeat Chicago Bureau Chief Becky Vivi. Hey, Becky, so give us a scope. How many schools did you find are under-enrolled, and where exactly are they?
Yes, so we looked at the most severely under-enrolled schools, which are more than 2/3 empty, and there are about 47 of them, and the most of them are on the south and west sides. And interestingly, we have a number of high schools that fall into this category. Now, it gets really difficult when you are a high school to have under-enrollment because the fewer students you have, typically the less money you get, and that it makes it very difficult to offer a robust set of course offerings to, the 100 or so students you have enrolled.
So students are getting shortchanged in some of those schools, but your report found that the cost per student in some of those under-enrolled schools, let's say DuSable, which was one you highlighted, it's $50,000, opposed to in a well-utilized school, it's $18,700. And then there's the Frederick Douglass Academy. It's $93,000 per student. Frederick Douglass is, there you see it there. Frederick Douglass is the emptiest school in the district. So why does it cost so much more at one of these lower enrolled schools?
So it kind of boils down to this economies of scale concept. So if you have fewer students and yet you still are staffing a full program. So CPS in the last couple of years has subsidized many of these small schools. And in the last year, the most recent year, they did a formula change on the budget, which also guaranteed a set number of teachers to all of these schools that are operating. And when you have, let's say you have 10 teachers and 5 administrative staff, so you have 15 to 20 staff members guaranteed, but you are only enrolling, in the case of Douglass, 30 students, the math works out to have that very high per student cost. Now, there are questions that some have raised with us, and that I think behind the scenes you hear people grappling with, is how do we operate more robust programmings for these schools and for these students without necessarily, we have a budget challenge, as you're aware of, in Chicago public schools. And so I think that it's really a sticky question, and one that really officials have avoided for the past few years,
and
10 years.
Absolutely, because this 2013 closure of 50 schools under then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, there's still aftershocks from that. We know how the CTU feels about school closures. Mayor Johnson has called it terrorism. 12 years out from that 2013 closure, do we have any notion of what the ultimate impact has been?
Of the 2013 closures?
Yes.
Or just, yeah, so we did take a look a couple of years ago at where students from those schools ended up and where they went, and we did see some higher transfer rates, and we saw a lot of movement from those schools, even more so than comparable schools in those neighborhoods where those schools were closed. Most of them, again, were on the south and west sides. It was mostly elementary schools, and so we were able to track where those students went. Now, most of them have, at this point, I think all of them have graduated, and so we have really had about 12 years in this district where there haven't been mass closings or really any closings. And I think that we've seen some stability come from that. And of course, there was a global pandemic in all of that time. So there was movement from students at that time. But yeah, we did see a lot of fluctuation, and we didn't necessarily see higher outcomes. And some research looked at the students who left those schools. Only the ones that enrolled in the very top performing schools ended up having sort of better academic outcomes long term. The rest really, it was either detrimental for them, or there was no difference in their kind of educational outcomes.
And again, this conversation on further school closures, I mean, we know there's a moratorium. We know how the CTU feels about it and Mayor Johnson feels. At the same time, what do other experts say are potential solutions to this under-enrollment? Again, we know the financial situation of the school district, and now you're reporting showing that it really leads to undesirable educational environments.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we heard from experts and others who've studied school closures is that planning is very important, and yet many districts do not take the time to plan, and they usually will wait until there is sort of a crisis moment where a budget needs to be closed, or there's issues with such severe under-enrollment that they take drastic action, similar to like what happened in 2013. So I think what's interesting for us when we were reporting, and Mila Kumpalova and Jennifer Smith-Richards, who were the lead reporters on this story, really found that a lot of people saying it's time, now would be the time to start long-term planning, to have a discussion about what the district's offerings across the board look like, and where can they either attract additional enrollment or potentially consolidate buildings and consolidate programs to offer students better options and opportunities in the neighborhoods where we've seen declining birth rates or just a loss of population.
All right, in your story, Becky, I know a lot of folks on the board saying it's not a discussion anyone wants to have right now, but it sounds like one that they ought to. Congratulations on the story, and I urge everyone to check it out at chalkbeatchicago.com. Thanks, Becky.
Thanks so much, Paris.